She didn't come back because she missed him. She came to make a deal. 7 months ago, Brynn had walked out of the most fortified building in New Orleans, with a copy of Serrano's personal ledger pressed flat against the lining of her coat and $40 in cash to her name. Today she was standing in the marble lobby of the Bowmont Tower, 8 months pregnant, and holding that same ledger in a manila envelope. The only leverage she had left, and the only exit strategy she'd been able to put together in a city that wasn't hers. The cab driver had charged her extra. He'd seen the building from 3 blocks out and gone quiet, gripping the wheel tighter with each passing block. Everyone in the quarter knew the Bowmont. They knew it the same way they knew about floodwaters, not because they'd been inside, but because they understood what it was capable of. Brynn paid him with the last of her cash and did not tip. She didn't have it to spare. At the lobby entrance, the security guard, young, wide-shouldered, professionally blank, stepped out from behind his station. He looked at her face, and then his eyes dropped to her stomach, and something behind his professional blankness flickered and failed. "Ma'am," he cleared his throat, "this is a private building." "I know what it is." Brynn tucked the envelope under her arm and shifted her weight. Her lower back had been grinding since Baton Rouge. "Tell Serrano that Brynn Cavett is downstairs. Use those exact words." The guard's throat moved. He recognized the name. Of course he did. She'd worked on this floor for 2 years. More importantly, she'd been the reason the building went on lockdown for 72 hours last October, when Serrano's people realized she was gone. He pressed 2 fingers to his earpiece and turned away. Brynn waited. The lobby was cold, climate-controlled to the temperature of a server room, and she couldn't button her coat anymore over the shelf of her stomach. She pressed one hand against the underside of the swell, a habit she'd developed somewhere around month 5, when the baby had stopped feeling like a terrifying abstraction and started feeling like a person who needed steadying. 30 seconds, she said quietly, not to the guard, to herself. 30 seconds and we get what we came for. The elevator bank at the far end of the lobby chimed. The doors slid open. Serrano walked out. He was in a dark suit without the jacket, sleeves pushed to the elbows, the way he always dressed when he'd been at the building since before dawn. He was talking to someone on his phone, low and clipped, the kind of conversation that ended careers. He didn't look up immediately. He was scanning a document in his other hand, the same way he always moved through a room, taking in information from every surface at once. Then he looked up. The phone call stopped, not ended, stopped. Whoever was on the other end went unanswered. Serrano stood 15 feet away and looked at her. His face was a language Brynn had spent 2 years learning to read, and what it said right now was something she didn't have a word for. His eyes moved from her face to the envelope under her arm, and then down, and then stopped. He lowered the phone slowly to his side. The lobby was very quiet. "Clear the floor," Serrano said. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. The guard disappeared. The 2 men near the elevator bank evaporated. A woman in a pencil skirt who had been crossing the lobby reversed course without being told. Serrano walked toward her. He stopped 3 feet away. She had prepared for this. She had rehearsed the exact words in the back seat of the cab from Baton Rouge, had run the numbers on every possible version of this conversation, the way she'd once run his quarterly accounts. She was a bookkeeper. She dealt in columns. She had a plan. "I have the ledger," she said, "the full copy. I'll give it back today in exchange for a clean exit, new identity, enough money to cover 18 months of living expenses, and a guarantee, in writing, witnessed, that you don't look for me or the child, ever." Serrano looked at her for a long moment. His expression did not change. Then he reached out and took the cigarette from behind his ear. She hadn't even noticed it, and placed it between his lips without lighting it. He did this when he was thinking through something he considered beneath the usual pace of his attention. It was the most frightening thing he could have done. "Come upstairs," he said. "I'd rather do this down here." "I'm not asking." He turned back toward the elevator. Brynn stood still for 1 beat, 2, measuring the distance to the lobby doors, versus the weight of the envelope in her hand, versus the grinding ache in her lower back that had started to pulse with something sharper and more deliberate in the last hour. She was not going to make it to a bus station tonight on her own. She knew that. She had known it before she got in the cab. She followed him into the elevator. His office on the 19th floor looked exactly the way it had looked the last time she'd been in it. The same wall of rain-streaked windows overlooking the river bend. The same desk, wide, dark walnut, clean except for a single open ledger and a coffee cup that had long gone cold. The same controlled stillness that the room seemed to generate on its own, as if the air itself knew to behave here. Brynn sat in the chair across from his desk because her back was screaming, and she was not going to give him the satisfaction of watching her try to stay upright. Serrano didn't sit. He stood at the window with his hands in his pockets, looking out over the river for a long time before he turned around. "Whose is it?" he said. It was not a question. It was the kind of statement that expected the other party to fill in the blank. The way he spoke in negotiation rooms when he already knew the answer, and was verifying that the person across from him knew it too. Brynn looked at him steadily. "Are you genuinely asking me that, or are you just making me say it out loud?" A muscle moved in his jaw. "Say it out loud." "Yours." She kept her voice flat the way she'd kept it flat in the lobby. Flat was safe. Flat was a column of numbers that balanced. 7 months along, due in 6 weeks. "I did the math. I know how to do the math. That's what you paid me for, and there's no one else. I don't need you to believe me. I need you to accept the terms I offered downstairs and sign something your lawyers can make enforceable." Serrano was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked to the desk, picked up the manila envelope she'd set on the edge, and tore it in half. Not angrily, deliberately, with the same measured economy he applied to everything. He dropped both pieces into the wastepaper basket and looked at her. "Try again," he said. Brynn felt the heat rise in her face and forced it back down. "Those are the only terms I'm offering. Then we're going to be here for a long time." He pulled the chair from behind his desk, turned it around, and sat with his forearms across the back, facing her. This close, she could see the tiredness in him that the building's lighting usually softened. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper than she remembered. His knuckles carried a new scar near the left index finger, something that hadn't been there before she left. "Why did you run?" he said. "I told you downstairs. You told me what you came to trade. I'm asking why you ran." He looked at her directly. "You had a job. You had an arrangement. You were good at what you did, and I paid you well for it. And one night in October, you walked out and did not come back. I want the real answer." Brynn breathed in through her nose. Outside, a cargo barge was moving slowly up the river, its lights leaving long orange streaks across the water. "I found a line item," she said finally, "in the internal accounts. Q3 reconciliation, the file you never asked me to close out." She watched his face. $42,000. Paid out to a contractor, coded under building maintenance. The memo field said, "Resolution of accounts payable, cavet position." Serrano went very still. "I didn't know if it meant me specifically, or if it was a standing contract for whoever held my role," Brynn said. "I didn't wait to find out. I'd been in your books long enough to know what that kind of language means." She paused. "I found out I was pregnant 3 days after I found that entry, and I left." The silence in the room was dense. The clock on the far wall ticked through several seconds. "Who authorized that payment?" Serrano said. His voice was quiet and entirely colorless. "I don't know. That's why I didn't come to you first. If you authorized it, coming to you was the last thing I should do. If you didn't, then someone inside your operation was moving money without your signature, which means they had enough access to do it quietly, which means I also wasn't safe either way. So you ran." "I ran." Serrano stood. He turned back to the window and stood there with his hands at his sides. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way it ran up the column of his neck, the visible work of holding himself in a state that he would probably call calm, and that anyone watching would recognize as its opposite. "You should have come to me," he said. "I know that now." Brynn pressed her hand flat against her stomach, where the baby had been restless for the last hour, doing the slow rolling shifts that meant it was running out of room. "I also know I found out I was carrying your child 3 days after I found evidence that someone in your organization had paid to have me removed. I made the decision that made sense at the time." Serrano turned around. He looked at her hand against her stomach. He looked at it for a long time. Then he crossed the room and crouched in front of her chair, which was not something she had ever seen him do in 2 years. He was a man who did not lower himself to other people's eye level. He looked up at her and then, slowly, watching her face the whole time, he placed one large hand flat against the side of her stomach. Brynn's first instinct was to pull back. Her hands came up toward his wrists. He didn't move. He just held very still, his palm against the curve of her belly, and waited. And then the baby shifted. A hard, deliberate movement, a heel or a knee pressing outward against his hand like a question that expected an answer. Serrano inhaled once, sharp. His eyes dropped to where his hand rested against the fabric of her coat. He didn't speak. He didn't move the hand away. "You felt that," Brynn said, because the look on his face was the look of a man who needed someone to confirm that what had just happened was real. "Yes," Serrano said. His voice was not the voice that cleared lobby floors. He stayed crouched in front of her chair for another moment, his hand still resting against her stomach, his face doing something private and unspeakable that she did not have the right to name. Then he straightened and walked back to the window and stood there with his back to her. And she understood that he needed a moment she was not going to be able to give him right now, and she let him have it. The knock on the office door came 20 minutes later, while Serrano was on his third circuit of the room, and Brynn had migrated from the chair to the leather sofa along the wall because her pelvis had stopped cooperating. Vidal came in without being asked. He was Serrano's operations man, careful, efficient, the kind of person who measured twice before speaking and then spoke in complete sentences. He looked at Brynn, looked at Serrano, and handed over a tablet without preamble. "Street camera from the block east of the building," Vidal said. "Silver SUV parked for 40 minutes before Miss Caffert's cab arrived. Moved when she went inside." He paused. "Plates are registered to a shell company we've flagged before. Connected to Orville Raid." Serrano looked at the tablet for a long time. "Who is Orville Raid?" Brynn said. "Was," Serrano said. "He ran our import logistics until 8 months ago. I cut him loose." Brynn felt the understanding settle into her chest like cold water. "The Q3 payment." "Very likely." Serrano handed the tablet back to Vidal. "Find out who was in the vehicle. I want to know where it went." Vidal left, the door closed. Brynn looked at Serrano. "They were watching the building. They saw me come in." "Yes." "Which means they know I came back. They know about." She stopped. She pressed her hand against her stomach, not out of habit this time. If they had eyes on me before I came inside, they could see. "Brynn." He said her first name, which he almost never used. He crossed to where she was sitting and sat on the edge of the coffee table in front of her, elbows on his knees, putting himself at her eye level with deliberate care. "You are in this building. There are 46 people between you and the street. Nobody is coming through those 46 people tonight. And tomorrow," he looked at her steadily, "tomorrow I will have resolved the problem." "By which you mean?" "By which I mean it will be resolved." He was quiet for a moment. "The man who authorized that payment against your name, I didn't know about it. I want you to believe that or not believe it. That's your choice. But understand that nobody placed a contract on anyone in my organization without my knowledge and kept breathing for long." Brynn looked at him. She had spent 2 years reading his accounts, which were a particular kind of autobiography. She had learned how he thought in the language of numbers, what he valued, what he wrote off, what he considered non-negotiable. She was good at knowing when something balanced and when it didn't. This balanced. "I'm not asking you to trust me," Serrano said. "I'm asking you to stay in this building for the next 48 hours while I clean up a problem that should have been handled before you ever found that ledger entry." His eyes moved briefly to her stomach. "Then we're going to have a different conversation, not about exit terms." "About what, then?" "About what comes next." Brynn leaned back against the sofa and closed her eyes. Her lower back had graduated from grinding to a dull, constant throb that she'd learned to carry the same way she'd learned to carry most things in the last 7 months, by putting one foot in front of the other and not measuring the distance to the end. She hadn't eaten since Baton Rouge. She was aware of that in the abstract, the way she was aware that she'd been running for 7 months, on the kind of stubborn conviction that didn't actually weigh anything when you put it on a scale. She had come here because she'd run out of options. She'd told herself it was strategy. She'd framed it as a transaction because transactions had terms and terms could be controlled. But she had also come because she was 8 months pregnant in a city that didn't know her name, with no one on her side, and the only person who had ever made her feel like the room was safer when he was in it was the most dangerous man she had ever worked for. She was not going to say any of that out loud. 48 hours, she said. 48 hours. And then I want to see whatever documentation your lawyers draw up before I agree to anything. Something shifted at the corner of Serrano's mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the recognition of a familiar frequency. I would expect nothing less from you. He had Mrs. Tran, the building's housekeeper, open the residential suite on the 21st floor. It was used for business guests and looked like a high-end hotel room that had forgotten it was supposed to feel temporary. Dark hardwood, heavy linen, a bathtub that cost more than 3 months of Brynn's Baton Rouge rent. Mrs. Tran didn't ask any questions. She ran a bath, left a tray of food on the kitchen island, and set out clothes that were 3 sizes too large in every dimension except the one that mattered. Brynn ate standing at the island because she was too tired to sit and too hungry to wait. She ate until her hands stopped shaking. She hadn't realized they'd been shaking until they stopped. Later she stood at the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city below. The river was dark now, the lights of the far bank making long broken lines in the water. The soft knock at the suite door came at 11:30. Serrano came in without a jacket, without a tie, in a way she had never seen him in 2 years of working inside his organization. He looked older and quieter, and like someone who had just come from a conversation that had cost him something. He set a glass of water on the kitchen counter and stood there, looking at his hands. "Vidal confirmed it," he said. "Reed authorized the payment himself and coded it through 3 layers of internal transfers. He'd been skimming small amounts for 2 years, testing what I noticed, what I didn't. When I cut him loose, he decided to cover his tracks." He looked up, by removing the person most likely to eventually find the discrepancy. "Me. You." Brynn sat down carefully on the edge of the sofa. "Is it handled?" "Reed is no longer a concern. The men in the SUV are also no longer a concern." She didn't ask for specifics. She had always understood that there were parts of Serrano's operation she managed in columns and other parts she did not look at directly, the same way you don't look directly at a source of heat and expect to see it clearly. "There's something I didn't tell you downstairs," Serrano said. He was still standing at the counter, maintaining the distance with a precision that felt intentional. "The reason I was still looking for you after 7 months, after most people would have stopped." Brynn waited. "There's a file in the main system, under access logs. Every time I had someone run a trace on your ID or your financials or your last known address." He stopped. He pressed 2 fingers against the counter. "There were over 300 entries in 7 months. I checked it myself, most days. Even when my people told me they had nothing." His voice was even, controlled. The voice of a man who had decided to say a thing and was going to say it all the way through. "I was not looking for you because of the ledger." The room was quiet for a moment. "You kept my books for 2 years," he said. You found errors that 4 accountants before you had missed. You sat across that desk in October and told me I had a liability in my Eastern portfolio that was going to cost me 7 figures if I didn't restructure before Q4, and you were right, and you didn't once look like you expected me to thank you for it. He looked at her directly. I was looking for you because I don't have many people around me who tell me the truth in complete sentences and then go back to work. Brynn looked at him for a long moment. That's a very careful way to say something, she said. I'm a careful man. I noticed. The baby shifted then, a rolling pressure against her right side, the kind of movement that always felt like an editorial comment on whatever was happening in the room. Brynn pressed her hand flat against it and felt the small, firm weight of a heel pushed outward, deliberate and insistent. Come here, she said before she'd made a decision about saying it. Serrano crossed the room without hesitation. He sat on the sofa beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off his arm, and she took his hand, his large, scarred, meticulous hand. She pressed it flat against the right side of her stomach, where the heel was still pushing. He went completely still. The baby pushed back against his palm, with the same certainty it applied to everything, a certainty it had not learned from either of them, and had arrived with entirely on its own. Serrano's breath came out slowly. He didn't move the hand. He stayed very still, his palm cradling the side of her stomach, and Brynn watched the particular silence that moved across his face, the careful fortified man peeling back one careful fortified layer and did not look away from it. I came back because I ran out of money, she said. That part was true. I know. I also came back because I couldn't do this alone anymore. I thought I could. I'm good at doing things alone. But she stopped. I kept thinking that this person was going to come into the world and the only thing standing between them and everything out there was me. And I'm tired, Serrano. I'm very tired. He turned to look at her. This close, she could see the fine scar along his jaw that she'd never noticed in 2 years of professional distance, a thin, pale line that disappeared into the edge of his beard. You don't have to be, he said. I know you can't promise the danger is gone. I know that's not how your world works. No. But I need you to promise me something that's actually true. Not that it'll be safe. That you'll put this child first. That when it comes down to a choice, and it will, eventually, you'll choose differently than you've chosen before. Serrano was quiet for a long time. He looked at her hand over his, at the place where his palm met the curve of her stomach, at the steady small pressure of the baby pushing back against both of them. I've spent 20 years building something I told myself was permanent, he said. I have not until this moment thought seriously about what I wanted to exist after me. He paused. I want this to exist after me. It was not a romantic declaration. It was a balance sheet entry, stated in the language of a man who thought in ledgers and long-term liability, and the weight of what endured, which meant it was, for him, the truest thing he knew how to say. Brynn leaned her head back against the sofa. The fatigue she had been carrying for 7 months settled into her bones like a tide going out. You're going to try to run my schedule, she said. Almost certainly. I won't let you. I'm aware. And when the baby comes, I want a real hospital, not a basement clinic. I have a relationship with St. Genevieve's, private wing, top attending and a neonatal team on standby. She looked at him sideways. You planned for this. I planned for the possibility. He looked back at her with the level, unreadable expression that she had spent 2 years trying to decode. I plan for most possibilities. She thought about the 300 search entries over 7 months, the daily checks, the man who had built a business on never showing his hand, running a trace on her financials every morning before the rest of his city woke up. Okay, she said. It was not a surrender. It was the first entry in a new ledger, balanced, tentative, neither of them pretending they knew where the final column would land. 6 weeks later, in a private room on the 4th floor of St. Genevieve's Hospital, Brynn held her daughter for the first time and felt the weight of her, real, warm, improbably small, and understood that no amount of bookkeeping prepares you for the arithmetic of this particular moment. Serrano was in the chair beside the bed. He had been there for 11 hours. His suit was rumpled, his tie was gone. When the nurse placed the baby in his arms for the first time, he went rigid with the particular stillness of a man who had handled fragile things before, but never like this, never anything like this. He sat with her for a long time without speaking. Eventually he looked up, and Brynn saw on his face something she did not have a number for, something that lived outside the columns she had built her professional life inside, and she understood that this was the entry that would never reconcile cleanly, and that she was going to stop trying to make it. Outside the window, New Orleans was going on being itself, loud, layered, indifferent to the small, enormous thing happening on the 4th floor. Inside the room, Serrano held his daughter with hands that had never once been gentle for anyone's benefit but his own, and learned, quietly and without being asked, to be careful in a new way. That was enough. For now, that was everything.